So for our introduction this morning, I'd like to pose two scenarios to you. I'll give the initial scenario, and then I want you to think how you would react to the initial facts of the case that I'll give. And then I'll go back and fill in some significant background. So scenario number one, a man is working in his garage on a Saturday afternoon. He's the kind of person who does not like to be interrupted while engaged in a project. Single-minded, we might call him. Knowing this, his wife walks out into the garage and stands quietly beside her husband for several minutes, waiting for the proper time to speak. At last, her husband looks up, and the signal he gives to her, she is free to say what is on her mind. Now, some of you ladies might describe this lady in rather uncomplimentary terms, but that's a whole other story. Based upon that description, you might say this woman is courteous to her husband, respectful, complimentary. Scenario number two. Suppose you heard this week that I grabbed my daughter's hair and violently yanked it out of her scalp. What would you think of me? Would you be tempted? By the way, this did not literally happen. This is a scenario. Okay. Would you think of me? Would you hotline me as a child abuser? Would you think that I have a severe anger problem? Would you begin to question my pastoral calling? Now, let me replay the scenarios and give you further information. Here's the man in his garage on a Saturday afternoon, a kind of man who does not like to be interrupted while he's engaged in his work. Knowing this, his wife comes to the garage, stands quietly beside him for several minutes, waiting for the proper time to speak. At last, her husband looks up and signals her that she's free to say what is on her mind, to which, very calmly and without any trace of panic, she says, "Sweetie, our house is on fire." Now, does your view of her change? Or scenario number two. Suppose you find out that Emma and I, this past week, are taking a walk in the evening, the two of us, having a wonderful time talking. And I look over Emma's shoulder, and there is a runaway, out-of-control vehicle headed Emma's way in her direction. She does not see it because her back is turned. I reach out and grab her to pull her back, and the only thing I can get a hold of at the last second is her ponytail, in which I violently pull her back to escape the car that crashes where she would be standing. Now is the scenario and your perspective of me different based upon the full information. You might go from claiming the woman as respectful and courteous to she is indifferent and passive and needs a priority adjustment. And the husband certainly would understand if she came running into the garage, interrupting him sawing to save the house. And your perspective of me might go from being some violent rube that's out of control and needs to be hotlined to a hero. We have a little motto in our culture that says, "Desperate times call for desperate measures." That is what we have when we plop smack dab in the middle of Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. Paul speaks in colorful language. In fact, there are some terms he uses in this section today he uses nowhere else in all of his writings, only here. They're quite colorful. They are meant to get the attention of the church and to do it, as he says, quickly. Time is of essence. So for the first time in Paul's letters, and for the only time in Paul's letters, he does not give a blessing to the church that he writes to. No pastoral blessing in Galatians. He launches rather into a series of curses for this church that is doing what he is absolutely godsmacked about. He cannot believe they are doing what they're doing, and so desperate times call for desperate measures. In the book of Galatians, and I know as pastors we have a tendency to embellish things that don't need to be embellished or shouldn't. And so we have this sort of flippant way of saying, the gospel is at stake. I hear that all over the place today, and really the gospel is not at stake. You just don't know your theological priorities. But here in Galatians, really the gospel is at stake. And so Paul quickly and rapidly uses very colorful imagery to shift the church back where it needs to be, so that they don't go to hell, as he says in verses 8 and 9. Now, the gospel is center stage in Galatians. That is the central feature, and we'll unpack what that means as we go along. In our text today, the word for the gospel, euangeleo, and its derivatives, is mentioned in every verse. So the gospel is central to our section today. In the first section of Galatians, where we were last week, verses 1 through 5, we could say that Paul defined the gospel for us. And if you weren't here last week, without sounding the least bit ego-centered, I would say you need to get last week's sermon, not because it was great, only because it is a summary of the book. And if you understand last week's message, you've got the entire book, particularly as it frames chapter 6, verses 13 through 16. They go together, and everything between chapter 1, verse 4 and 5 to chapter 6, verses 13 through 16, we'll say, are the frame, and all of the book go back to those two matters. Paul defines the gospel. Now remember, in the church of Galatia, the churches of Galatia, there are several different types of people in this church together. There are Roman Gentiles who love the Roman virtue, the Roman politics, the Roman way of life, except for the paganism, because they come to Christ. But they're still a Roman. They don't cease being a Roman citizen. They're a Gentile, and they come into these churches that Paul starts. A second group are Romans who grew up in the first century but became disenfranchised and disoriented and displeased with their government. They saw in their government no more of a Roman virtue, but paganism and corruption. And so they looked for a good morality, and they found it in Judaism with their laws. And so they're Roman Gentiles who convert to Judaism, and then later in the synagogue they convert to Christianity. They're known as God-fearers. If you ever hear that term in Acts particularly, and in some of Paul's letters, that's that group of people. They are born a Gentile, not born a Jew. They grow up a Roman. They become disoriented with the Roman way of life, convert to Judaism because of their morality, but then later convert to Christianity. They're a part of this gathering of churches. And then finally are a Jew, born a Jew, grew up a Jew, holding to the Jewish law, and they convert to Paul's gospel. We could throw in a fourth that we meet today, but that's the primary collection of the church that Paul is writing to. So he's writing primarily to people who are aware of Jewish culture and the law. Their only Bible would be the Old Testament. The word gospel that is translated for us gospel, euangela, is used all over the place in the Old Testament. I have given you several references in your notes to Isaiah's use of the gospel. Now, he is not, nor are translators. If you go to these verses, you're never going to see the term gospel, but you're going to see translated good news, which is what the gospel is. So in the Jewish mind, the gospel was going on long before Jesus came in terms of its definition. But in every passage, at least in the Isaiah passages that I've given you, every time it has a messianic connection. So perhaps the most famous Isaiah passage that we know that uses the gospel is the passage, "How beautiful are the feet of him who brings euangeleo," the gospel, good news, and announces peace. So that is the image of, in wartime, a messenger. They didn't have internet back then or a cell phone. The only way to communicate between battlefield and victorious city was a runner who would run over hill, mountain, and valley and run with great speed. Remember, David gets into this as a runner, says, "I just came from the battlefield of Saul, and I saw this." And that is very customary because that's their only means of communication. And in the Isaiah passage, the one who does this brings the gospel, good news that we have triumphed over our enemies. And every time in Isaiah, this has a messianic connection of Israel, the people of God. When the Messiah comes, he is going to vanquish all the evil of the world and then restore them, and they in turn will live in the Messiah's benefits. That's how the Jews understood this term, gospel, before it was Christianized. Paul, masterfully, a converted Jew to Christianity, uses their understanding of good news and its messianic link to right out of the gate present the gospel of Jesus. When he says, Jesus is the Messiah, he has come and vanquished, what does he say in verse 4? Rescued us from the present evil age, and now it's a whole new world. And that's why his big beef will get in. Don't live your life in the pre-messianic world as if Jesus Christ did not die and rose again. By the way, the only time the resurrection is used in Galatians is verse 1 of chapter 1. Paul never mentions that. It's not insignificant, but he's focused on the cross and the killing and what Jesus did. He delivered us from this present evil age, and now it's a whole new world. Don't go back under a pre-messianic circumcision, the law, as if Jesus did not die. You got that last week. That's the definition. Today is, we might say, a declaration of war to defend the gospel. Now, Charles Spurgeon said the gospel does not need defending. It's like a caged lion. Just let it loose. But here, Paul's verbiage is not so much defense as attack. The best defense is a good offense. Paul goes on the attack. And everything he is accused of in Galatians, and he'll talk about it later in chapter 1 and 2, but everything he is accused of, here he takes it and throws it right back in the faces of these people. So the definition here of the gospel, or the good news imagery, Paul's point is the central idea of verses 6 through 9, the one thing you need to know, we're going to double back on this, is there is one and only one gospel. And that, remember, is defined in the preceding verses. Jesus died for your sins, rose again to rescue from the present evil age and deliver you to a new world, a world where he is the Messiah. That's the gospel. Christ died and rose again. There is only one and only one gospel. There are not different gospels like you can go to a Chinese buffet and choose your own adventure, picking what gospel you want depending on which mood you're in. We hear of that today. All my life I've heard of a personal gospel. Now we hear of social gospel. Once upon a time we heard of Andrew Lloyd Webber's gospel. But there is one and only gospel of Christianity, and that is that Jesus Christ died and rose again and is meant to deliver you from this present evil age to a new world. This truth is central to our section today. Paul is beside himself to learn that after 3 years of ministry on the province of Galatia and 1,500 miles that he traveled, that this church is now going to another gospel, and he cannot believe it. So drastic times call for drastic measures. Sometimes you could not. Sometimes silence is golden. Sometimes silence is just plain yellow. Here, Paul is the megaphone of God to rouse a church back to the gospel. So if we can eavesdrop on his pen and his personal letter to these Galatian churches, I want to, in sequence, take it in a different manner. I want to break it down and put it back together. First, we want to look at who Paul is addressing and what they're doing. And I want to maybe go from least to greatest. You could argue about that. I'm just arguing in terms of the amount of information in Galatians. So let's start with Paul's identification of a group of people in this church that so that I can remember it with a mnemonic device, call the disturbing distorters. So all of these could be in D if you wanted them. The disturbing distorters. Both of these are based upon the action line of how Paul describes them. First, here is verse 7, that he finds out, this is when he comes back from his missionary journey that he spent 3 years. He's at Antioch, getting ready to go to the Jerusalem Council, highlighted in Acts 15. And while in Antioch, he hears that there are people stirring up trouble for you. This is one of only 2 times in the letter he uses to describe these people. Now, he's going to give us more information about them in chapters 1 and 2, but for now, they are disturbers. A disturber is an agitator, a troublemaker, a pot stirrer. To use the modern language, they love to create drama. That's what these people are. They have come in the church. They weren't there when Paul was there. At least they were not recognized. It's only after Paul leaves. And by the way, that seems to be their MO. If you read the end of Corinthians, if you read parts of Philippians, if you read parts of Acts, these people seem to follow Paul everywhere he goes. After he leaves the church, they come in to destroy it, to cause trouble. Now, Paul is going to give more information about them, but this word here for disturb or troublemaker or distress, the same word is used in a key place for us to better understand these people. If you would turn to Acts chapter 15. Now, Acts chapter 15 is important not only for the first century, because I believe it documents one of 5 historical events that changed the first century world for the advancement of Christianity. Without this, I don't think Christianity advances. But it's very important also because if, as I believe it's true, Acts 13 and 14 describe Paul's missionary journey to Galatia, and Paul writes the letter prior to going to Jerusalem, then Acts 15 is after he writes the letter, dispatches it, and goes down to Jerusalem. And what is at stake in Jerusalem Council is the 3 years Paul was in these Gentile churches. Should the Gentiles be considered equal Christians? Do they have to be Jews to be Christian? Do we have to go back to a pre-Messianic world for this to be legitimate? And there are several speeches. We won't read the whole chapter, although it's wonderful. It's really, as a historian, it's sort of our first confession or our first creed, you might say, written by a church in an official capacity. We have speeches by Paul. He brings Titus and he talks about his missionary work to Galatia and how God used the gospel to redeem the Gentiles and bring them into the church. He uses the speech of Cephas, or Peter to us. Cephas on purpose used of his Jewish name. Paul will do that deliberately play on that in Galatians 2 because his point is Peter's more Jewish than he is Christian. So he deliberately writes Cephas. And Peter makes a speech in favor of Paul, ironically. James, the brother of Jesus and arguably the most influential leader in the church of Jerusalem, gets up and he makes an argument for the gospel to the Gentiles, and then they draft this creed. And it's official because it will be copied and sent out to all these churches in the Roman world about what the church of Jerusalem has rendered in their understanding of what Jesus Christ wanted in the gospel. And their very first line, we hold these truths to be self-evident. 7 years ago, the very first line, which is going to be remembered. Acts chapter 15, verse 24. We have heard that some persons have gone out from us and troubled you with words. There is the exact same word Paul uses in Galatians 1:7 to describe the troublemakers. They're talking about them now in the official creed. They're unsettling your minds. And then he adds, the whole church adds something that helps us understand what these people are doing, although we gave them no instructions to do this. We learn in Galatians 2, when the Jews come up from Jerusalem into the area of Galatia and cause trouble. This is where Peter, gets up and sits at their table. That they actually implies that they're using the apostles of Jerusalem as their muscle. That is to say, they're going into these churches, causing trouble, saying Paul doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a two-bit, illegitimate, non-ordained, upstart apostle. We have the authority of the apostles of Jerusalem to their heresy. And the apostles are saying, we didn't give them any authority to talk this way. They're actually causing trouble. You need to know, this is the official document we've rendered, and all of them apparently sign it. We didn't give them any authority. Well, what are they saying? Verse 1 of Acts 15 is helpful in what these troublemakers are going into these churches and what is causing Paul to be fit to be tied. Verse 1 of Acts 15, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you're circumcised, according to the custom taught by Moses. What is the next line? Do you see it? You cannot be saved unless you become a pre-Messianic Jew. That's what they're saying. You got to go back under the law of Moses. The law of Jesus, it's too simple. I mean, if you want to believe in Jesus, fine. But if you're going to be saved, if you're going to be one of God's people, you've got to go back under the very thing the gospel fights against. That's what these troublemakers are doing. More on that in Galatians 1 and 2. But that's what's at stake. So when Paul says, I've heard these troublemakers are coming, and then when he adds, and they are distorting the gospel, that means to alter, they're jimmy-rigging it. You've heard the cliche, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The gospel ain't broke, they're trying to fix it. They're saying, Jesus thinks, but you got to be circumcised. You got to eat certain foods under the law of Moses. The law of Moses trumps Golgotha. And Paul is fit to be tied. He said, that's not a gospel. That's not a gospel. The second people that get the brunt force of his attack, by the way, in every letter, it's not the troublemakers, it's the church that allows it that gets the full force of his fury. He does that in Corinthians, right? It's not the guy caught in adultery, it's the church that allows it. That Paul, and here in Galatians, the troublemakers are bad. He's going to let them have it here in a few moments. But it's the church that has gone off and that Paul cannot believe. And so in verse 6, he introduces these people. I'll call them as the deserters or the devoted deserters. They desert and then are devoted to another gospel. The word here, desert, means to abandon one's loyalty, to turn away from. The earliest the Greeks used it was in a famous case of a celebrity in politics or philosophy. In early Greek times, there were two camps known as the Stoics and the Epicureans. I don't know if you studied that in high school. One of my high school honors classes right now, I don't teach it, but they said, hey, we're learning about the Stoics and Epicureans and Paul attacking them on Mars Hill. I don't know if you know anything about the Stoics and Epicureans, but there was one Stoic philosopher early in his career, Dionysius, who was a famous orator of the Stoic philosophy. He attacked with a vengeance the Epicurean philosophy, and about halfway through his career, he jumped ship and converted to Epicureanism. And then he became their chief voice and attacked the Stoics. And the Stoics developed a term which Paul uses here for a turncoat. We know this in modern politics. If a Democrat mid-congressional year switches to be a Republican or vice versa, they're a turncoat politically. And that's the word used here. It later became employed by the Romans for someone who defects in the middle of war. An armed officer marching, and like the scene in a famous Braveheart, if you've ever seen the movie, where William Wallace has this alliance with two lords of their manors. When he gave a signal, they would come in and flank the enemy. He gives the signal, they smile, and they turn their back and they walk their army away, thus giving William Wallace up to Edward the Longshanks. They become turncoats, yellow bellies. And Paul is saying to the church, I am hearing things about some of you going to another gospel, and you are, in fact, a Benedict Arnold. You're a Judas. You're a linguining-spined, nimble-minded, gutless wonder, yellow-bellied traitor. I mean, this is pretty colorful. And they're going back to another gospel. And even in usage of this word, Paul uses Jewish imagery. In the Old Testament, this word is used almost exclusively when someone leaves the law and they go back into the world. There are sections of Deuteronomy that charge them with being a turncoat, a traitor. And for Jews, if you abandon the law, you have abandoned the God of the law. Which, by the way, is exactly what Paul says here. Verse 6, what does he say? He'll speak of the content of the gospel in the next few verses, but here he says, I have heard that many of you are turning away from the one who called you by grace. Do you see now how personal it is? Not only are you deserting the gospel, you're deserting the God of the gospel. You're leaving Him. This is how serious this is. Walking away from the gospel is not a mild thing. You're walking away from God who gave it to us. Well, those are the people. Most of this section is Paul's reaction. He frames it. So his first reaction is in 6a, and his second reaction, which dominates, is in verse 8 and 9, and it's repeated for emphasis. The first reaction is astonishment, or if we use our D paradigm, we could say dumbfounded. The dumbfounded apostle. The word he uses is, I'm astonished that you've turned away so quickly. The Galatians have been lured away by another gospel, and Paul, this is the word that is only used here in all of Paul's letters. He will never use it again. Most of the time in the New Testament, and 10 times as a matter of fact, the most it's used is in the Gospels related to Jesus. After Jesus heals someone, for example, when he heals someone of being a mute, someone that's been mute his whole life, and he heals it, the crowd's reaction is this same word, astonishment. They cannot believe both the power and the speed. It's not like a guy sort of gets better and in a year or two he's completely cured. Immediately this guy can speak by the power of, and they're shocked and in a good way. That is the word Paul uses here. When he hears that the church has gone back to another gospel, left the gospel that Jesus Christ died and rose to give us a whole new world, he is stunned. He cannot believe it. And as a pastor, I sort of understand. I tried to understand, Paul was there 3 years. He probably feels it's been a waste. Because he just got back to Antioch, getting ready to go, and he just gets back to Antioch and he hears about this. Imagine I retire after 25 years, which, man, that's not too long from here. So I never know, what God has for me, but my goal is, I'd love to retire at the ripe old age here. But a lot of things, you have to want that too, and so does God. But let's suppose that after 25 years, I retire as pastor of Calvary Baptist Church. But I come back 6 months later to preach a funeral. And I come into the worship service, you have your new pastor, and I realize that half of you who grew up with me, who I've known in this church for years, are gone. And I begin to inquire, and I've heard, they went back into the world. They've announced they're not a Christian. And then I talk to the ones that are remaining, and I hear about their gospel, and they believe that, Buddha, the god of the corn, Oprah, it doesn't matter, we'll all get there. And these are people that I've known you for decades, and if I heard that, I would walk away similarly to Paul. I would feel that 25 years of my life was a waste. I've wasted my life with these people. That they would so quickly. Notice the terms there in verse 6. It's not only what the church does, it's how quickly they do it. It's the speed. They didn't even give the gospel a chance. First troublemaker that came, okay, we'll take that. We'll go back under the law. And Paul is stunned. I can't believe you people would do this. Don't you know what you're doing? Don't you know what's at stake? Well, if they don't know what's at stake, he's about to tell them. That's in verses 8 and 9. The word anathema, or A's, astonishment, anathema. If you're going with a D, damn. There you go. So the dumbfounded, damning apostle. Because that's exactly what anathema means. He's not using it pejoratively or profanely. He's using it quite literally. May God damn you to hell if you go back and try to think you'll be saved under anything but the gospel. May God damn your soul to hell. So he uses this word for anathema, a Jewish term, by the way. We can find it in the Old Testament. It literally means a curse or a ban. The closest picture we have to this, that is familiar to you, is in the story of Achan. You remember that? Where Israel has this amazing military victory at Jericho. Amazing in that they have no casualties. When has that happened? No one dies in a battle on Israel's side. Why? Because God did everything. The walls came down, and all they do is march. It's a party. They just march and blow trumpets. This amazing victory of Jericho. And God tells them before going in, do not take any war booty. No rewards, nothing of that. You protect Rahab and her family, but everything else gets destroyed, decimated, as if it didn't exist. Along comes Achan, who takes a little bit of the war booty, hides it underneath his tent. We're so stupid when we sin. Did he not think the God that could single-handedly tear down Jericho would know what he's doing? I mean, what dumb. But he does it anyway. And it's not a victimless crime. Because hundreds of thousands of Israelites, it cost them their lives. Remember, they go to the Battle of Ai, the next battle, a battle they should have won easy because it's smaller, not as defended, and they lose, and thousands of Israelites, innocent Israelites, are butchered and slaughtered, and Joshua is stunned. So stunned that he goes into the presence of God, and this, by the way, a beautiful prayer. He sort of kind of interrogates God, but he throws it back in God's face when he says, you know, what's going to happen is all these foreign Canaanites are going to come back and they're going to demolish us. And then, I love the line, then what will you do for your glory? You've chosen us for your, what if we're wiped out, what will you do for your glory? And then he gives the revelation that this imposter, this disobedient Rube has done this. And you remember how the sort of execution became. It started with general, went to a tribe, went to a clan, finally got to the family, and they anathemized Achan. They banned him from camp and the people. Never again would he have fellowship with Israel. He would be forever and completely cut off. And then they executed him and his family and took nothing of his family. It was as if he did not exist. And that's where that visual of anathema comes. Paul says here that a false gospel, and by the way, he's reversing the accusation. The rival teachers have accused Paul of leading the people astray. He throws it back into their face, and he says, if anyone, an angel, an apostle, anybody comes and preaches the message other than the only way you can be saved is by the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, who delivers us from this present evil age, gives us a whole new world. If you want to add to that, jimmy rig it, fiddle with it, make it haywire, try to duct tape it, improve upon it, hold it up, may your soul be damned to hell by God. May you be cut off from God's presence forever. No hope for you. And to up this ante, if it couldn't get any colorful, Paul in the text, if you look at it in verse 8, is not just talking about the troublemakers. He has them in mind. He has the church in mind. But what does he say? If anybody does this. That's why he enters an angel and apostle. I don't care who they are. If anybody has the temerity to add to the gospel of Jesus Christ, may he be cut off from God's presence. That is not a how to win friends and influence people speech, is it? Now, I will say today that there's a lot of anathemizing going around. It seems that everyone is a heretic and everyone likes to label it. And I would just say in 90% of the cases that I see on social media, it is not anathema level. It is not heresy. So I would say to some people, you need to tone it down a little and understand really what is at stake. But if it is the gospel, if someone is trying to meddle around with the gospel message that saves and makes us completely new people, let them be cursed. Let me be a little more colorful. It doesn't matter if some among us have PhDs and are scholars and know languages, or how long you've been a Christian or a Sunday school teacher. If anybody of any place comes into this assembly and begins to teach and live in such a way that the cross and the resurrection is not enough or the only thing, then brothers and sisters, let us throw them off and let us trust little Rachel Brewski, a little girl who would come in here with her blonde hair and blue eyes and say, I believe Jesus died on the cross and may her species multiply, and you can build a church around her. But may the others rot in eternal damnation. The gospel is worth fighting for. And that is what is at stake here. Paul will use it again in 1 Corinthians to talk about these same people, but he'll add something there. He'll say anathema to those who do not love the Lord. There we go again. To mess with the gospel is to mess with the God of the gospel. Here in the climax of this letter, we come to verse 9, where Paul, for emphasis, repeats himself. just to let us to know what is at stake, just in case he's been missed. Now, brothers and sisters, on one end, I would say that anathema and heresy has been misused, but on the other hand, I would say that I think we're living in days where Protestants don't know what they're protesting, and Roman Catholics don't know why they're Roman Catholics. We have a gospel problem. I would like to conclude today with a long sermon. Now you think, what did we just have? With one of my heroes, I talked about him last week. His name is Martin Luther. Now, I've said this before. Luther's not perfect. Got a lot of blind spots. But if I could go back in a time machine, I would want to live with Martin Luther because it would never be a dull moment. Luther gave a commentary to Galatians twice. It is the only commentary that Luther writes twice. He loved it. He wrote his first edition in 1517 and wrote a whole nother commentary in 1535. His last sermon occurs in 1546. He preaches it in Eisleben 3 days before he dies. When he dies on his deathbed. His last words, it's very interesting. The first are in German, the last are in Latin. Why he did that, I don't know, but he does on his deathbed. So this sermon is 3 days before he dies. It's his last sermon. And it's quite a sermon to go out. He has all of his cognitive abilities. He dies young, basically. But what is going on in Luther's day is, we might say, kind of sad. He is the Protestant reformer. 1517, he did so much to stay in the Roman Catholic Church. He did not want to be a troublemaker or rabble. He did everything he could to stay within the Roman Catholic Church as an Augustinian monk. But he finally realized, we got a break. The gospel's at stake. And of course, along came the Protestant. You're Protestant in many respects because of him. You're a protester. But he found that before he died, in the 4 decades of the Protestant Reformation beginning and in 1546, that those converts that were coming into the Lutheran Church, by the way, he despised the name Lutheran. They were actually saying that about following before he died, and he was livid that they would use his name. He said, "Who am I? Follow Christ." So I always tell my Lutheran friends that. You know, your founder didn't like you calling yourself Lutherans. But he found that people were coming into the church out of Rome, coming by justification by faith alone in Jesus Christ, but then were going back to Rome. He found that before he died in his own lifetime, and he was stunned. And he preaches a sermon out of Matthew 11, that is his text, and he brings this up. A lot of dead people encourage me because I laugh a lot. When you hear this, can you imagine sitting here and listening to this? So this is about the last paragraph. So he's going to say this, go home and die. And this is vintage Luther, and I only commend this to you because it merely reflects Galatians 1, 6 through 9. Here's what he says. In times past, we have run to the end of the world if we had known a place where we could have heard God speak the gospel. But now we hear the gospel every day in sermons. Indeed, now their books are full of them, and we do not see people running to pure churches to hear the gospel preached anymore. You might hear it at your home, in your house. Father and mother and children sing and speak of it. The preacher speaks of it in the parish church. And when he does, quite frankly, you ought to lift up your hands and rejoice that you have been given the honor of hearing God himself speak through a man to his word, because very few people get it. Oh, people say, what is that? After all, there's preaching every day, other times every other day. So what have we done? We've grown weary of it. What do we get out of it? All right, go ahead, dear brother. If you want God to speak to you every day at home in your house and in your parish church, then be wise and look for something else. In Trier is our Lord God's coat. In Achan are Joseph's pants and Our Lady Blessed's loincloth or dress. That would be a dress, a chemis. So what he's saying here, so you understand, is he's saying if you don't like the gospel and you want something other, I know a church that has Joseph's coat you can worship to have your sins absolved. And I know our Blessed Virgin has a dress, a place you can go to worship. So he's saying, go serve these trinkets, which some of them are. Go there and squander your money, buy your indulgence and the Pope's second-hand junk. But the gospel is what is of value. You have to go far for these things and spend a lot of money, leave the house and home standing idle. But aren't we stupid and crazy people? Yes, we're blinded, and many of us possessed by the devil. There in Rome sits the decoy duck with all of his bag of tricks, luring to himself the whole world with his money and goods, and all the while, anybody free of grace can find Jesus. How highly honored and richly blessed we are to know that God speaks with us and feeds us His word, gives us His baptism, and gives us the keys by grace. But these barbarous and godless people say, what, baptism, sacrament, God's word? No, let us go get Joseph's pants. That's what does it. It is the devil in the world who makes these high personages, and along with him, the emperor and kings. Oblivious to such things and causes them to allow themselves to be so grossly duped and fooled and besmattered with filth by these first-class rascals and liars in the pulpit, and also the Pope and his tonsured shavelings. But we will listen to the gospel alone, which tells us that Christ is our schoolmaster, and we will have nothing to do with Joseph's pants or the Pope's juggling tricks. Last line he says, he goes home and he dies. Don't you love Luther? Oh my. Brothers and sisters, from Paul to Luther to you, there is one and only one gospel. And you can never say you love the church if you fiddle with the gospel, as we see here. The best churchmen, the best churchwoman are gospel lovers. And at our church, methods will come and go. Personalities change, times change, all that is appropriate. The gospel of Jesus Christ, it says, never does. And woe to us if we try to fiddle with it. So we have a choice. We can go to American evangelical morality. We can go to American evangelical decisionism, or some other things that would add to the gospel to say you must do this to be saved, or we can keep what Paul is trying to trumpet. May I humbly suggest, it is finished. Father, I thank you for this assembly. I thank you for this word by Paul. I hope I've represented it correctly by your grace. It is strong. It's forceful. And God, I fear today more and more that is what we must have. We might not like it. I may not like it. But it's you. It is your character. It is what you want for your people. And as we will see later in this letter, it is a liberating, loving thing to truly live in this whole new world where Jesus is the Messiah. I pray for anyone here today that does not know you, would they take their eyes, as the old song says, take their eyes and turn them upon Jesus. Look full in your wonderful full face and the things of earth and all that go with it, self-righteousness, morality, religion, do's, don'ts, all of that will grow strangely dim in the light of your glorious grace. This I pray in the name of Jesus our Lord and for His sake. Amen.